In early 1945, the Western Front no longer resembled a campaign envisioned months earlier. German defenses had not collapsed, but they had bent unevenly, leaving gaps that shifted faster than headquarters could stabilize them. The Ardennes counteroffensive had been contained, yet its aftermath complicated every estimate. Units were depleted, roads damaged, fuel scarce. Winter still imposed friction on all movement. For the German General Staff, the situation demanded recalculation rather than optimism. Across the lines, Allied command faced its own constraints. Supply lines stretched back to ports still recovering from damage. Armored divisions required fuel and maintenance faster than depots could guarantee. Infantry formations rotated through the line with little rest. The question confronting Allied leadership was not whether to advance, but how far and how fast without risking overextension. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, reports accumulated in steady sequence. Front commanders submitted assessments that varied in tone but converged on the same reality. German resistance was inconsistent. In some sectors, it stiffened abruptly. In others, it fell back with little coordination. Reconnaissance suggested that German reserves existed more on paper than in practice. Yet no one could confirm where the next offensive line would truly form. Dwight D. Eisenhower reviewed these reports without haste. He was accustomed to balancing competing pressures, political and military, strategic and immediate. The push toward the Rhine had been planned as a deliberate process, shaped by logistics and coalition coordination. A premature thrust risked exposing flanks and exhausting supplies. A cautious approach risked allowing German forces to recover coherence. Messages from field commanders reflected this tension. Some urged restraint, citing stretched supply columns and damaged infrastructure. Others pressed for authorization to exploit openings while they existed. The weather offered no certainty. Conditions could shift within days, grounding aircraft or opening skies to Allied air power. Within German headquarters, analysts followed Allied movements with increasing concern. Intercepted communications and reconnaissance reports suggested preparation for something larger than localized probes. Rail movements east of the Rhine increased, but not enough to restore confidence. Replacement units arrived incomplete. Equipment shortages persisted. Defensive plans assumed time to consolidate, time to rebuild depth. German planning staffs had worked through multiple Allied scenarios. A cautious advance, a pause to rebuild. Limited thrust tied closely to logistics. None of these models fully accounted for a rapid, broad authorization to push forward across multiple axes simultaneously. Such an action appeared risky given Allied supply constraints and winter conditions. As February progressed, the front shifted incrementally eastward. American and British units tested German lines repeatedly, forcing withdrawals that were orderly but increasingly shallow. Each retreat reduced available defensive space. The Rhine loomed not only as a physical barrier, but as a psychological one. German command assumed it would impose a pause, a moment of recalibration on the Allied side. At Eziev, Eisenhower convened senior commanders. The discussion was restrained, focused on facts rather than ambition. Supply officers outlined limitations without embellishment. Intelligence summarized German dispositions with acknowledged gaps. Air commanders spoke cautiously about weather windows. No single argument dominated the room. Eisenhower listened, then asked for confirmation of one point. If authorized, could the armies maintain pressure across the front without collapsing their logistics entirely? The answer was qualified but affirmative. It would require risk. It would require prioritization. It would require accepting that not every sector would advance at the same pace. The decision did not come as a dramatic announcement. It emerged as a directive, transmitted through formal channels. Authority was granted to press forward where conditions allowed, to exploit German weakness without waiting for a uniform alignment of resources. The advance was approved, not as a reckless gamble, but as a calculated acceptance of uncertainty. German intelligence detected the change quickly. Movements increased in scope and coordination. What had appeared as probing attacks now aligned into sustained pressure. The pace did not match pre-war doctrines or earlier Allied patterns. It was uneven but persistent. Within the German General Staff, officers reviewed their assumptions. The expectation of a pause at the Rhine no longer held. The belief that Allied caution would dominate decision-making began to erode. Reports from the front contradicted planning models with uncomfortable consistency. One staff officer noted that nothing in the pre-offensive estimates had anticipated such authorization under these conditions. Others agreed without debate. The Allied advance was no longer reacting to German weakness alone. It was shaping the battlefield according to a decision that accepted risk rather than deferring it. As orders moved down the Allied chain of command, units prepared to move again, adjusting plans already in motion. The front did not explode forward, but it did not settle either. Pressure increased steadily, compressing German responses. By the end of the week, the pattern was unmistakable. Eisenhower's approval had altered the tempo of the campaign. The German general staff understood that their calculations, careful and detailed, had failed to predict the moment when restraint would give way to resolve. The consequences of that realization were only beginning to unfold. The shift became evident first at the operational level. German field commanders reported Allied units advancing with fewer pauses between engagements. Where earlier movements had waited for full logistical alignment, columns now moved as soon as minimum requirements were met. Engineers repaired bridges under fire. Supply officers rerouted convoys without waiting for written confirmation. The front compressed unevenly, but relentlessly. German headquarters attempted to impose order through revised offensive instructions. Units were told to hold ground longer, to trade space only when necessary, to preserve cohesion above all. These directives collided with reality almost immediately. Formations that existed at half strength could not hold extended lines. Artillery units rationed ammunition carefully, often falling silent at critical moments. Communications lagged behind events. Reconnaissance reports indicated Allied armor probing beyond expected limits. In some sectors, infantry advanced without armor cover, relying on speed and local fire support. Losses increased, but momentum was maintained. The advance did not follow a single axis that could be anticipated and countered. It spread pressure laterally, forcing German commanders to respond everywhere with limited means. Within the German general staff, daily briefings grew shorter and more frequent. There was little time for theoretical discussion. Each report demanded an immediate response, often without adequate information. Reserve commitments were debated repeatedly, then executed partially, then reconsidered as new threats emerged elsewhere. One assumption after another failed quietly. The expectation that Allied logistics would force synchronization pauses proved unreliable. Supply constraints slowed advances in some areas, but not enough to restore German initiative. The belief that winter terrain would channel movement into predictable corridors also weakened as Allied engineers expanded road capacity and repaired crossings faster than anticipated. German planners had expected Eisenhower to enforce a rigid alignment of forces before authorizing sustained movement. Instead, his approval allowed initiative to flow downward. Local commanders exploited opportunities as they appeared, even if that meant advancing beyond neighboring units temporarily. German intelligence noted this decentralization with concern. It complicated defensive planning by denying clear points of focus. At the front, German units experienced the effect as constant contact. Even when major assaults were absent, pressure persisted through patrols, artillery harassment, and air attacks whenever weather permitted. Rest became scarce. Reorganization was interrupted repeatedly. Commanders spent more time reacting than planning. Reports from the Rhine sector unsettled the general staff further. Allied preparations near the river suggested that it would not become the operational pause once assumed. Bridging materials moved forward earlier than expected. Engineer units trained under conditions that implied imminent use rather than contingency planning. The political dimension weighed heavily as well. German leadership demanded stabilization, not explanation. The general staff balanced military reality against directives that left little room for withdrawal or consolidation. Each failure to halt Allied progress tightened that pressure. Intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations confirmed Allied confidence. There was no indication of a strategic pause being discussed. Eisenhower's decision had removed ambiguity at the top. The advance was not conditional on perfect conditions. It was conditional only on the ability to move at all. By late February, German field commanders reported that defensive lines dissolved faster than they could be reestablished. Villages intended as strong points were bypassed or reduced quickly. Attempts to concentrate forces for counterattacks were disrupted by air strikes and artillery before they could form. Within the general staff, acknowledgement spread that the Allied advance was no longer constrained by traditional caution. The approval from SHAF had changed not only movement, but expectations. German defensive models relied on predictability. That predictability was gone. A senior officer summarized the situation bluntly during a closed meeting. The enemy was advancing not because conditions were favorable, but because waiting offered no advantage. That logic had not been included in German estimates. As the meeting adjourned, new reports arrived indicating Allied crossings approaching the Rhine sooner than projected. The river, once considered a buffer that would enforce delay, now appeared as another obstacle to be overcome rather than a line to be respected. The pressure intensified without dramatic escalation. There was no single breakthrough to point to, only a steady erosion of defensive capacity. Eisenhower's approval had set a process in motion that did not depend on perfect execution, only on continued action. By the time the General Staff reconvened, it was clear that the crisis was no longer localized. It had become systemic. The advance was accelerating in consequence, if not in speed, and the window for restoring strategic control was narrowing faster than any plan had anticipated. The recognition that the situation had become systemic forced a change in the internal tone of German deliberations. Meetings once structured around projections, and contingencies shifted toward damage control. The question was no longer where to stop the Allied advance, but how to slow it enough to preserve any coherent defensive posture east of the Rhine. Field reports arrived with increasing urgency. Commanders described units dissolving under pressure rather than breaking outright. Withdrawals intended to be orderly became fragmented as roads clogged with mixed elements, vehicles without fuel, and civilian traffic fleeing the front. Attempts to restore discipline consumed time that no longer existed. German planners examined the pattern of Allied movement more closely. Eisenhower's authorization had removed the expectation of a synchronized pause, but it had not produced recklessness. Advances halted briefly when supplies failed, then resumed along adjacent routes. The front behaved like a fluid surface under pressure, yielding where resistance weakened and pushing elsewhere without waiting for full alignment. This behavior challenged the core of German defensive doctrine. Their planning depended on identifying main efforts and secondary thrusts, concentrating reserves accordingly. Now, effort shifted continuously. What appeared secondary one day became decisive the next. Reserves committed to seal one gap arrived too late, diverted en route to meet another. Within the General Staff, officers acknowledged that intelligence no longer translated into actionable foresight. Reports were accurate, but by the time they were compiled and assessed, conditions had changed. Eisenhower's decision had accelerated the Allied decision cycle beyond German capacity to respond. A debate emerged over whether to attempt a deliberate stand at the Rhine, regardless of cost. Some argued that the river still offered a chance to impose structure on the battlefield. Others warned that reaching it in disarray would negate its defensive value. Both sides agreed on one point. The Allied approach to the river had not been anticipated in this manner. Meanwhile, Allied units nearing the Rhine reported readiness rather than exhaustion. Bridges captured intact and rapid engineer construction altered timelines repeatedly. German demolition succeeded in some sectors, failed in others, but even success produced only delay, not pause. Intercepted Allied communications reflected careful coordination rather than hesitation. Eisenhower's approval had not diminished central oversight. It had clarified intent. Field commanders understood the objective was sustained pressure, not symbolic milestones. This clarity reduced friction within the Allied command structure and empowered initiative without confusion. German attempts to impose counterpressure through limited offensives faltered quickly. Shortages of fuel and ammunition constrained duration. Air superiority disrupted assembly areas. The window for decisive local action closed almost as soon as it opened. As March approached, the General Staff confronted an outcome that planning had placed months later, if at all. Allied forces stood poised along broad sections of the Rhine, not as a single mass, but as multiple coordinated groupings. The river no longer promised a strategic reset. It threatened to become another phase of retreat. One officer remarked that nothing in the original assessments had accounted for a supreme commander willing to accept operational imbalance to maintain tempo. Eisenhower's approval had overridden the assumption that caution would dictate Allied behavior under logistical strain. That assumption had anchored German expectations from Normandy onward. Orders issued from Berlin grew increasingly detached from conditions at the front. Whole directives conflicted with physical impossibility. Commanders adapted quietly, prioritizing withdrawal over compliance. The gap between instruction and execution widened. As the General Staff prepared new defensive outlines east of the Rhine, they did so without confidence that time existed to implement them fully. The Allied advance continued, not as a dramatic surge, but as an accumulation of irreversible decisions made under Eisenhower's authority. By the time the next briefing concluded, reports confirmed Allied crossings imminent in sectors previously considered secure. The approval that had once seemed premature now defined the campaign's trajectory. German planners understood that the turning point had already passed, not marked by a single battle, but by a decision that nothing in their models had predicted. The imminence of the Rhine crossings forced the German General Staff into a final confrontation with its own assumptions. Defensive outlines east of the river existed on paper, but the forces required to man them coherently were no longer available in sufficient strength. Units that reached the east bank did so unevenly, often without heavy equipment, sometimes without clear command relationships. What was meant to be a line became a collection of fragments. Allied pressure did not pause to observe the river as a boundary. Engineer units moved forward alongside combat formations, bridging equipment already allocated and rehearsed for use. In some sectors, unexpected opportunities emerged when German demolitions failed or were executed too late. In others, crossings were forced under fire with losses accepted as the price of momentum. German headquarters received confirmation of the first successful Allied crossings with a mix of resignation and urgency. These were not isolated raids. They were sustained efforts, immediately reinforced and expanded. Attempts to counterattack across the river faltered almost at once, constrained by fuel shortages, disrupted communications, and Allied air activity. Within the General Staff, the debate over whether Eisenhower would authorize such actions under winter conditions and strained logistics ended definitively. The approval had not only been given, it was being exploited fully. The Allied command did not wait for perfect alignment. It accepted local imbalance in exchange for irreversible progress. Orders issued to German field commanders grew increasingly stark. Hold where possible. Delay where holding was impossible. Preserve what remained of organized force structure. These directives acknowledged implicitly that the strategic initiative had been lost. The goal was no longer to reverse the advance, but to survive it. At the front, German soldiers experienced the crossings as a collapse of predictability. The river had been described as a barrier that would restore order. Instead, it became another point of contact, another place where Allied pressure appeared faster than anticipated. Defensive positions hastily prepared on the east bank came under attack before they were complete. Allied communications intercepted during this phase reflected controlled urgency. Timelines were compressed, but not chaotic. Eisenhower's intent flowed clearly through the chain of command. Crossings were to be expanded, not merely secured. Opportunities were to be exploited immediately, not deferred for consolidation. German countermeasures lacked coordination. Artillery fire was limited by ammunition shortages. Armored units arrived piecemeal, or not at all. Air support was largely absent. Each attempted response revealed the depth of imbalance between planning and reality. The General Staff confronted the fact that their predictive frameworks had failed at the level that mattered most. They had anticipated Allied capability, but not Allied willingness. Eisenhower's approval had signaled a shift from managing risk to imposing it on the enemy. German planning had assumed the opposite. As reports accumulated, it became clear that no single corrective action could restore the situation. The advance had crossed a threshold. Each successful crossing generated conditions for the next. Delay in one sector was offset by progress in another. The front no longer offered a focal point where resistance could be concentrated decisively. Senior officers spoke openly, if quietly, about the implications. The war in the West had entered a phase where German choices were constrained almost entirely by Allied decisions. The initiative, once contested, now belonged decisively to the opposing command. By the end of the week, Allied bridgeheads east of the Rhine expanded despite repeated German attempts to contain them. Supply routes followed quickly. Artillery crossed. Armor followed. The sequence unfolded with an efficiency that reflected long preparation combined with decisive authorization. The approval Eisenhower had given weeks earlier now revealed its full weight. It had not promised success without cost, but it had ensured that opportunities would not be wasted. German defenses, already brittle, fractured under sustained pressure. As the General Staff prepared its next assessment, there was no illusion left about restoring the situation. The advance had achieved what planning had deemed unlikely under prevailing conditions. Nothing in the estimates had predicted this sequence, not because the facts were unknown, but because the decision proceed regardless of imperfection had not been accounted for. The final phase was no longer a question of whether the advance could be stopped at the Rhine. That question had already been answered. What remained was to understand how a single authorization had altered the balance irreversibly, and what consequences would follow as the front continued to move eastward without pause. The consequences unfolded with a clarity that required no interpretation. As Allied forces pushed eastward from the Rhine, German command structures lost what little coherence they had preserved through discipline alone. Orders issued from higher headquarters arrived too late to shape events. Field commanders made decisions based on immediate survival rather than strategic alignment, often without reliable communication or support. Eisenhower's approval now revealed its full meaning. It had not been a single operational choice, but a release of accumulated pressure. Allied armies advanced not in a single wave, but in overlapping movements that denied the German command any stable reference point. Towns fell in rapid succession, sometimes after brief resistance, sometimes after none. The distinction mattered less than the continuity of movement. German attempt to establish new defensive lines east of the Rhine dissolved under the same conditions that had undone earlier plans. Shortages of fuel immobilized armored elements. Infantry formations, under strength and exhausted, could not hold extended fronts. Artillery fire became sporadic, dictated by ammunition scarcity rather than tactical necessity. Within the German General Staff, admissions replaced projections. The failure was not attributed to courage or effort at the front. It lay in the inability to anticipate a decision that rejected the comfort of symmetry. Allied command had accepted uneven advances, partial supply solutions, and localized risk in exchange for sustained momentum. German planning had expected the opposite. Intercepted Allied communications during this phase reflected consolidation and exploitation, not uncertainty. Eisenhower's authority remained present, but it no longer needed emphasis. His intent had been internalized throughout the command structure. The advance continued because it was understood, not because it was repeatedly ordered. As American and Allied forces penetrated deeper into Germany, the collapse of remaining resistance followed a familiar pattern. Units surrendered in groups, sometimes intact, sometimes fragmented. Attempts to rally forces around symbolic locations failed quickly under air attack and artillery fire. The capacity to impose delay diminished with each kilometer lost. German officers reviewing the course of events noted that nothing dramatic marked the true turning point. There was no single battle that explained the outcome. The decisive moment had been administrative and strategic rather than tactical. Eisenhower's approval had altered the rhythm of the war, compressing time in a way German systems could not match. By the time Berlin received comprehensive reports, the situation was irreversible. The Western Front no longer existed as a coherent defensive system. It had become a zone of advance defined by Allied choice. German command adjusted its focus to managing collapse rather than preventing it. The General Staff's final assessments acknowledged the limits of prediction. Intelligence had been accurate. Material calculations had been thorough. What had been missing was an understanding of how leadership would respond when uncertainty outweighed caution. Eisenhower's decision had demonstrated that control could be maintained not by waiting for ideal conditions, but by acting decisively within imperfect ones. As the war in the West moved toward its conclusion, that realization remained. It did not excuse failure, but it explained it. Planning had assumed restraint where resolve had prevailed. The advance approved under conditions deemed unfavorable had reshaped the campaign beyond recovery. Nothing in the estimates had predicted it, not because the facts were hidden, but because the choice itself had not been considered likely. When Eisenhower approved the advance, he closed a door the German general staff believed would remain open. What followed was not chaos, but consequence, unfolding step by step until there was no longer space left to recalculate.